Alex found it tucked neatly beneath the corner of his doormat, held in place by a smooth, gray river rock. He picked it up, expecting a flyer for a new landscaping service or a neighborhood watch meeting. Instead, he found a folded square of thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of paper you use for wedding invitations or formal announcements. He unfolded it. The handwriting was a precise sloping script. No messy scribbles, no frantic capitals. It was the handwriting of a woman who had a lot of time on her hands. "Dear neighbor," it read, "while I appreciate the effort you've put into your backyard oasis, the continuous hum of your pool pump is quite intrusive. I work from home and find it difficult to concentrate. Might I suggest an alternative model or a simple adjustment to the filter schedule? A little consideration goes a long way. Sincerely, a concerned resident." Alex squinted at the note, his brow furrowed. He looked up at the quiet two-story colonial next door, its windows draped in spotless white lace. The house had been vacant for nearly a year after old Mr. Henderson passed, and a woman had moved in just last month. He'd seen her from a distance. A severe-looking woman with a perfect silver-streaked bob and a posture that looked like it had been carved from granite. He hadn't even gotten her name. He crumpled the note into a tight ball and tossed it into the recycling bin. "Intrusive," he muttered to himself. The pump was a low, constant thrum, no louder than a refrigerator. It was the sound of summer. The sound of his kids splashing in the crystal-clear water, of late-night swims under the stars. The pool was their sanctuary. The next day, it was the kids. Lily, his 9-year-old, and 7-year-old Noah were playing Marco Polo, their laughter, bubbling over the fence. The sun was hot, and the smell of chlorine and freshly cut grass hung in the air. Alex was stretched out on a lounge chair, a book in his hand, a small, peaceful smile on his face. He loved this. The pure, unadulterated joy of it all. A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see the neighbor, the woman with the severe haircut, standing at the edge of her yard, her hands on her hips. She was staring at his kids, not with a friendly smile, not with a wave, just staring. Her expression was a mix of disapproval and something he couldn't quite place, but it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Hello?" Alex said, putting his book down. "I don't think we've met. I'm Alex." She didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed on his children. "Your children are very loud," she said, her voice a clipped, low monotone. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the finality of a court ruling. Lily and Noah's laughter died in their throats. They stopped their game, treading water silently, their little faces turned toward the fence. Confused. "They're just playing," Alex said, his tone still friendly but with an edge of defensiveness. "It's summer. Kids are a little noisy." "There is a difference between noisy and disruptive," she said, finally tearing her gaze from the kids to look at him. Her eyes were a cold, pale blue. "And that," she gestured with her chin toward the silent, floating children, "is disruptive. The constant yelling, the shrieks. It's a violation of the peace." "A violation?" Alex's voice rose, slightly. He stood up from his chair. "Come on, they're kids. This is a residential neighborhood, not a monastery." "This is a quiet, respectable neighborhood," she corrected him, her voice holding no warmth whatsoever. "I moved here for the tranquility, a tranquility I am quickly learning does not exist." She looked back at the house, at the pool, as if surveying a crime scene. "I trust this won't be an ongoing issue. A pool can be enjoyed quietly, I'm sure." She turned on her heel and walked back toward her pristine house without another word. The silence she left behind felt heavier than any noise. The kids climbed out of the pool, shivering despite the heat, their fun for the day completely ruined. "What was that?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide. "Nothing, honey," Alex said, forcing a smile. "Just a grumpy neighbor." But it wasn't. Nothing. That night, another note appeared. This time, it was tucked into the handle of his back gate. It was the same elegant cardstock, but the message was different. I have spoken to the Homeowners Association regarding the noise pollution from your property. I am also keeping a detailed log of every disturbance. Please be advised that continued disregard for the well-being of your neighbors will have consequences. The word consequences was underlined. Not once, but 3 times, in thick, black ink that had bled slightly into the paper. It felt like a threat. The next few weeks were a descent into a quiet suburban hell. The conflict was not loud or explosive. It was a slow, agonizing drip of passive aggression and escalating psychological warfare. Mrs. Gable, as he learned her name was from the mail carrier, took her logging seriously. She was always there. Whenever the kids were in the pool, she would appear, either at her window behind the lace curtain or standing just inside her open garage door, just watching. Not with binoculars, not with a camera. Just with her cold, pale blue eyes fixed on them, logging. Her presence was a suffocating weight. The kids started to get nervous. They would whisper, "Is she watching?" before they even got in the water. Their laughter became muted, replaced by hesitant splashes and strained conversations. "Daddy," Noah said one afternoon, his little voice barely above a whisper, "can we just go to the public pool instead? She's scaring me." Alex's heart sank. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was eating away at their family's joy. It was invading their space, their sanctuary. He tried to reason with her. He walked over to her house one morning, a plate of fresh cookies in hand. She opened the door just a crack. "Mrs. Gable, I'm Alex. Look, I just wanted to talk. This whole situation is getting out of hand. My kids are afraid to be in their own backyard. We're not trying to be bad neighbors." She didn't take the cookies. "The solution is simple, Mr. Alex. You control your children, and you control the noise. I am a very peaceful person, but I will not have my tranquility disturbed." The door closed slowly, deliberately, in his face. The final straw came on a Saturday. Alex's wife, Sarah, had invited a few families over for a barbecue. They had lived in this house for 10 years, and they were the social hub of the cul-de-sac. It was a perfect day. The sun was out. The grill was smoking, and the air was filled with the sounds of friendly chatter and kids playing. They were all in the pool, the kids and the adults. The sound was a joyful chorus of splashing, laughter, and music, playing softly, from a speaker. It was loud, yes, but it was the sound of people living their lives, of community. Suddenly, the music cut out. The volume control on the speaker had been turned all the way down. Alex looked over and saw his neighbor, Mr. Harrison, his face pale and apologetic. "Mrs. Gable just called the police," he whispered, gesturing to his own house. "Non-emergency line. She said you guys were violating some noise ordinance." Alex's blood ran cold. The phone call came a few minutes later. It was a patrol officer. He was polite but firm. "Sir, we've received a complaint about excessive noise. We understand it's a party, but please keep the volume at a respectful level. The party died. The music was turned off. The kids were pulled out of the pool." The air went from joyful to strained. No one wanted to be a part of the noise violation. One by one, the other families packed up and left, their goodbyes filled with a mix of awkwardness and sympathy. Sarah found Alex by the fence, staring at the manicured lawn of Mrs. Gable's house. He was clenching and unclenching his fists. "I can't believe she did this," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. "Who does she think she is? We can't even have our friends over. We've lived here for 10 years, Alex. This is our home." "I know," he said, his voice flat. He looked over the fence. He saw her now, through her kitchen window, a faint silhouette. She was looking back. He knew it. She was savoring this, the quiet she had so desperately sought. That night, Alex couldn't sleep. He sat by the pool, the only light coming from the single, submerged light bulb. The filter pump hummed a low, solitary tune in the darkness. He felt defeated. This wasn't a battle he could win. He had tried being nice. He had tried being patient. And he had tried being reasonable. Nothing had worked. She had stolen their peace, their joy. He thought about the threats, the notes, the non-emergency calls, the way his kids' laughter had been muted, the fear in their eyes, the forced quiet she had imposed on their lives. An idea. A tiny, insane little spark ignited in the darkness of his mind. It was a flicker of something so absurd, so outrageous that it... The next morning, the house felt small and cold. Sarah was in the kitchen making coffee, her movements sharp and deliberate. The quiet was different from the one Mrs. Gable had tried to impose. This one was thick with unspoken tension, a simmering, resentment that had nothing to do with pool pumps or shouting kids. "What was that about last night, Alex?" she asked, not looking at him. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual warmth. Alex sat at the counter, a mug of coffee untouched in front of him. "What was what about?" he asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. She turned to face him, her hands braced on the countertop. "You know what? Don't play dumb. I heard you on the phone. You called the fire department, didn't you? You told them they could use our pool for a training drill." She shook her head in disbelief. "Alex, what were you thinking? This is insane. Are you so blinded by this woman that you're willing to turn our home into a circus just to get back at her?" "It's not just to get back at her," he said, a weary anger rising in his chest. "It's to get our life back. Our kids are miserable. Our friends can't even come over without her calling the police. She's not just a nuisance. Sarah, she's a bully. And I'm not going to let her bully us out of our own backyard by bringing a literal fire truck to our front door." Sarah's voice rose. "Do you have any idea what could go wrong? What if they damage the pool? What if they flood the yard? What if this spirals into some kind of lawsuit? We could lose our house over a petty feud." "It's not petty," he said, slamming his hand on the counter. The mug rattled. "It's about standing up for ourselves. I've tried everything else. I've been polite. I've been reasonable. I've tried to ignore it. Nothing works. This is the only language she understands. This is the only way to send a message so loud she can't possibly misinterpret it." The argument was a bitter pill, the first real wedge Mrs. Gable had driven between them. He could see the fear in Sarah's eyes, the justifiable worry. But beneath it all, he saw a flicker of his own frustration. She was tired, too. She just didn't have the same reckless abandon he did. Not yet. He heard the crunch of tires on gravel and saw a large white SUV pull into his driveway. The words, "Fire Department, Site Logistics," were stenciled on. The side. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of triumph and terror. He walked outside to greet them. Lieutenant Morales stepped out of the SUV, a broad-shouldered man with a friendly, weathered face. He was accompanied by an older man, a captain with salt and pepper hair and a stern expression. "Mr. Alex," the lieutenant said, extending his hand. "This is Captain Miller. I explained your unique request. He wanted to see it for himself." "Thank you for coming," Alex said, shaking their hands. "I appreciate you taking the time." They walked to the backyard. The captain's eyes scanned the yard, the house, the fence, and finally, the pool. His gaze was a professional assessment, not one of judgment. "It's a good size," he said, nodding slowly. "Access from the street is good, too. The hydrant on the corner is on the older side, so we've been looking for alternative drafting sites. This could actually work." Just then, a curtain on the second-story window of Mrs. Gable's house twitched. Alex didn't have to look. He could feel her eyes on them. It was a pressure, a physical weight in the air. As if on cue, the captain's eyes flicked to the neighbor's house. "The homeowner next door seems very interested in our visit," he said to Alex. his voice a low rumble. "She's the reason for all this," Alex said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "She's been harassing us for weeks over noise, my kids' laughter, the pool pump, everything." The captain looked back at him, his stern expression softening slightly. He seemed to understand now. This wasn't just a random offer. This was a man at the end of his rope, and the fire department was, ironically, his last resort. "We can't promise anything yet," the lieutenant said, pulling out a notepad. "We need to finalize the logistics. We'd likely use 2 engines, one with a main pump, one with a secondary for relay. We'd be running a lot of water. It would be loud and wet." "Loud and wet is exactly what I'm hoping for," Alex said, a grim smile on his face. The men finished their assessment, taking measurements and making notes. They shook his hand and said they'd be in touch. As they were leaving, Alex saw Mrs. Gable step out of her front door. She was wearing a neatly pressed sundress, and she carried a small decorative trowel as if she had been tending to her flowers. But her eyes were fixed on the fire department SUV as it pulled away, and her face was a mask of furious curiosity. The call came 2 days later. "We've got a confirmed date and time, Mr. Alex," the lieutenant said. "This Tuesday, we'll be bringing an engine and a rescue squad. We'll be running a full-scale pump operation, drafting from your pool, and we'll be testing some new hose reels. It's going to be a substantial operation. We'll have a few dozen guys there." Alex hung up the phone, a cold sense of exhilaration filling him. He had done it. When he told Sarah, her face went pale. "Tuesday? That's so soon. Alex, are you sure about this? Please, we can still call them and say we changed our minds." "No," he said, his voice firm. "It's done. We can't back out now. Trust me. This has to happen. For us." He spent the next 2 days trying to ignore Mrs. Gable, but it was impossible. She was a ghost, a presence that haunted every moment. He found her standing on her lawn, talking on her phone, and she would look directly at him, a predatory glint in her eyes. He saw her leaving her house with an empty camera bag slung over her shoulder. She was gathering evidence. She was preparing for war. On Monday, a certified letter arrived from her lawyer. It was a cease and desist order. It demanded that he stop all non-essential and excessive noise-generating activities and warned of legal action for harassment and emotional distress. The letter was filled with legal jargon, but the message was clear. She wasn't playing anymore. Alex crumpled the letter and threw it into the fireplace. It was too late. The train had already left the station. Tuesday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that was made for a pool party, or in this case, a fire drill. Alex woke up early. Sarah was already up, sitting in the living room, staring out the window, her arms wrapped around herself. The kids were nervous, asking a million questions. At 9 a.m. on the dot, the sirens began to wail in the distance. They grew louder and louder, a sound that made Alex's heart pound in his chest. A massive cherry-red fire engine with its lights flashing and its siren blaring turned the corner and lumbered down their quiet street. A second, smaller rescue truck followed behind it. The sound was deafening. Neighbors came out of their houses, looking up and down the street, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. The trucks parked on his street directly in front of his house. The crew, a dozen firefighters in full gear, spilled out of the trucks. They were a sight to behold. They began to unspool the massive coiled hoses, laying them across his front lawn and down his driveway. The air filled with the sharp metallic smell of the fire trucks and the faint scent of diesel exhaust. And then she appeared. Mrs. Gable stood on her porch, staring. Her face, usually so composed, was a grotesque mask of shock and fury. Her mouth was slightly ajar. She looked from the fire trucks to the hoses, to his pool, and then to Alex, who was standing on his porch watching her. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just watched her, his expression grim. She started walking toward the street, her steps quick and jerky. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice a high, frantic shriek over the low roar of the engines. "What is going on here? This is a quiet residential street. You can't do this!" A firefighter, a young guy with a crew cut, glanced at her and then back to his work, as if she were a minor, irrelevant detail. Alex just watched her, his eyes cold. She had wanted quiet. This was the exact opposite of quiet. Captain Miller walked over to her. "Ma'am, we are conducting an essential training operation. We have been granted permission by the homeowner to use their property as a static water source. It's a standard sanctioned drill." "Sanctioned?" she cried, her voice cracking. "This is harassment. This is a violation. I'll call the police. I'll call the mayor." "That's your prerogative, ma'am," the captain said, his voice calm and firm. "But this operation is fully documented. I'm going to need you to move to a safe distance." Mrs. Gable's face was beet red. She stormed back to her house. The firefighters, meanwhile, were a hive of focused activity. They connected the main hose to the pool pump, and a loud, deep hum began to vibrate through the ground. A firefighter dropped a suction strainer into the water. Alex watched as the water level in the pool began to lower slightly. A massive hose was extended down the street. It was a fire-breathing serpent, dormant for now. A firefighter at the end of the line gave a thumbs up. The captain gave the command. The air horn blast was deafening. It vibrated in Alex's teeth. The roar of the engine pump surged to a new, incredible volume. And then a torrent of water erupted from the nozzle at the end of the hose, a powerful gushing column of liquid that shot high into the air, arcing over the trees and raining down on the street below. The sound was immense. It was the sound of a waterfall, a roaring river. It was the antithesis of quiet. Alex watched the look on Mrs. Gable's face as the sound washed over her. It was a look of pure, unadulterated horror. Her kingdom of quiet was being torn down, not by chill. The roar of the fire engine pump died into a sudden, eerie silence. The only sounds left were the sloshing of water from the hose still draped across the yard and the sharp, clipped voices of the firefighters. The spectacle had shifted from a training drill to a crime scene. Alex stood on his porch, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He watched as Lieutenant Morales, Captain Miller, and a few of the other firefighters gathered around the small, grate-covered drain near the edge of his pool. The captain knelt down, a powerful flashlight beam cutting through the morning light, illuminating something dark and thick inside the pipe. The air around the grate had a faint, sickly smell. It wasn't chlorine. It was the unmistakable stench of waste. "It's a direct bypass line," Captain Miller said, standing up and looking directly at Mrs. Gable's house. "Look at the angle. It's coming straight from their main sewage line, right under the property line, and tying into this drain. The drain then flows into the city storm drain on the street. It's not connected to the pool's filtration system at all." The truth, a vile and shocking revelation, hung in the air. Mrs. Gable hadn't just been complaining about noise. She had been illegally routing her raw sewage into the public storm drain system, which was meant only for rainwater runoff. And the suction from the fire department's pump had just accidentally exposed her entire operation. Mrs. Gable, who had been standing on her porch, her face still a mask of horror and fury, now looked as if she had been hit by a physical blow. Her shoulders slumped. Her carefully composed posture crumbled. She retreated a step, her hand going to her mouth. She looked at the firefighters, at Alex, and at the dozen or so neighbors who had gathered on the street. Their conversations now, hushed. Their faces a mix of confusion and dawning understanding. Captain Miller strode toward her property line, his face grim. "Ma'am," he called out, "I'm going to need you to come out here. We have a serious situation." She shook her head, a pathetic, almost childlike gesture of denial. I'm "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "There must be some mistake. This is outrageous. This is all just a part of his little scheme." She pointed a trembling finger at Alex. "There's no mistake," Lieutenant Morales said, walking up beside his captain. "We have a direct line from your residence to this drain. We're going to have to call the police and the city's water and sewer department." The words were a death knell. Mrs. Gable's eyes darted around, looking for an escape, an explanation. There was none. She had been caught. The pristine, quiet life she had so painstakingly built was about to be obliterated not by Alex's petty revenge, but by her own deep, dark secret. She spun on her heel and ran back inside her house, slamming the door. The sound was a pathetic echo of the thunderous noise of the fire drill. Within minutes, the sirens began to wail again. This time, it wasn't the fire department. It was a patrol car, its blue and red lights flashing, followed by a city utility truck and another, unmarked, sedan. The quiet street had officially become a scene of major public interest. The patrol officers, a tall man and a woman with a no-nonsense expression, got out of their car. They spoke to Captain Miller, who pointed toward the grate near the pool and then to Mrs. Gable's house. The officers' faces hardened as they listened. The tall officer walked to her door and knocked. When there was no answer, he knocked again, louder this time. "Ma'am, this is the police. We have a report of a possible public safety violation. We need you to come outside." Alex watched from his porch, Sarah now standing beside him, her hand gripping his arm. The fear she had felt earlier was replaced by a kind of stunned awe. "Alex," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She was running sewage into the street all this time? That's what this was all about?" "I think so," he said, his eyes still fixed on her house. The full scope of her obsession with controlling his pool's noise now made a grotesque sort of sense. She hadn't just been annoyed by the sound. She had been terrified that the constant activity, the splashing, the filter, might somehow draw attention to her backyard, to that single hidden grate that was the source of her great secret. The police officer went to the rear of the house. Alex heard a voice over a megaphone. "Ma'am, we have a search warrant request being processed. I strongly advise you to open the door." A window on the second floor of Mrs. Gable's house opened. Her face appeared, wild-eyed and panicked. "You can't do this!" she screamed, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. "I have rights! This is all a conspiracy. That man, he set me up." She pointed down at Alex. A murmur went through the crowd of neighbors. They looked at Alex, then back at her, their disbelief giving way to a shared, stunned understanding. The perfect, quiet, meticulous Mrs. Gable was unraveling before their eyes. Alex didn't respond. He just watched. The woman who had accused him of being a disruptive neighbor and a noise polluter was now facing charges of environmental contamination. The irony was so immense it felt like a punch to the gut. Minutes later, a city van pulled up. Out stepped a crew from the water and sewer department wearing reflective vests and carrying equipment. They were here for the serious business of confirming the illegal hookup. They began to set up their own equipment, pulling out blueprints and conferring with the police officers. The meticulous, fastidious order of her yard was now being invaded by the chaotic, utilitarian presence of city workers. Inside her house, Mrs. Gable was in a frantic state. Alex could see her moving from window to window, pulling back the lace, curtains, watching the circus unfold in her front yard. She was a caged animal, cornered in her own, perfect home. He imagined her thoughts. The constant fear that one day a plumber, a landscaper, or even a city inspector would see that telltale pipe. A fear that had turned into a paranoid, obsessive need for quiet, to keep everyone away from her yard, to draw as little attention as possible. But Alex had done the unthinkable. He hadn't just drawn attention, he had invited the entire city, government to her doorstep. As the morning wore on, a judge signed the warrant. The police officers walked to her front door again, a piece of paper in hand. This time, they didn't knock. They used a key from a locksmith they had brought with them and let themselves in. Alex and Sarah watched from their porch as the two officers disappeared inside. The city workers were now digging at the property line, a loud grating sound that filled the street. It was the sound of her carefully constructed lie being unearthed. A few minutes later, the front door opened again. The officers emerged, and between them was Mrs. Gable. Her hair was disheveled. She wasn't wearing the neat sundress anymore, but a plain sweater and slacks. Her face was tear-streaked and splotchy. She was a different person. The mask was gone. In its place was nothing but raw, humiliating defeat. Her eyes met Alex's for a moment. There was no hatred in them anymore, just an emptiness, a profound and complete defeat. He had taken her house, her reputation, and her false sense of superiority, and he had done it all with a single phone call and the innocent sound of a fire drill. The officer put a hand on her shoulder and guided her gently toward the patrol car. As he reached for her wrists, the two quick clicks of the handcuffs were the only sound that mattered. They were a definitive, final exclamation point to the entire ordeal. The woman who had obsessed over a few errant noises was now being led away, the sound of her own defeat echoing for the entire neighborhood to hear. Justice had been served, not by Alex's hand, but by a powerful, ironic twist of fate. The street was a tableau of lingering chaos. The fire engines were gone, replaced by the white vans of the city's water and sewer department, their yellow caution tape a stark line across Mrs. Gable's front yard. The police car had long since driven away, its lights a memory. The crowd of neighbors was dispersing, their hushed conversations and pointed fingers a slow, creeping poison in the air. The spectacle was over, but the consequence, a silence far heavier than the noise that preceded it, remained. Alex and Sarah stood on their porch watching the scene. The exhilaration, the grim satisfaction that had fueled Alex's actions had dissipated, replaced by a cold, unsettling dread. This was no longer about a pool. This was about a public scandal, a criminal investigation, and a quiet, suburban street turned upside down. A woman from a few houses down, a kind-faced librarian named Susan, walked past and gave them a tight, pained smile. I'm so sorry about all this, Alex," she said, her eyes flicking to the digging crew in Mrs. Gable's yard. "It's just incredible. No one had any idea." The word sorry felt wrong. It wasn't an apology. It was a lament for a lost tranquility that Alex had inadvertently shattered. The neighbors weren't celebrating. They were looking at their own immaculate lawns, their neat driveways, and wondering if this kind of hidden ugliness was lurking just beneath their own soil. Alex was no longer a hero. He was a disruptor on an entirely new level. A sleek black car with a local news station logo on its side pulled up to the curb. A reporter with a microphone and a cameraman jumped out, their eyes scanning the street. They immediately zeroed in on the ongoing city investigation, and then on Alex's house, where the hoses still lay snaked across his lawn. "We should go inside," Sarah said, her voice strained. She pulled Alex's arm. He let her lead him in. The front door closed, but it didn't shut out the noise of the news crew's questions or the buzzing of the city's digging equipment. He walked through the house, the silence within it feeling oppressive. He saw his daughter, Lily, sitting on the sofa, clutching a pillow. Her face was pale. "Daddy," she whispered, her eyes wide with a fear he hadn't seen since the first time Mrs. Gable had appeared at the fence. "Is Mrs. Gable going to jail?" The question was a direct hit to the gut. It was one thing to be angry, to want justice. It was another to be the direct cause of a neighbor's humiliation and potential imprisonment, and to have to explain that to a 9-year-old. I don't know, honey," Alex said, his voice raw. They're just investigating. I don't know what's going to happen." He looked at Sarah. She was watching him, her face unreadable. The unspoken words hung between them. Was it worth it? His recklessness had solved one problem, but it had created a whole new set of larger, more serious ones. His small personal war had gone public, and he and his family were now caught in the crossfire. The next few days were a blur of unwanted attention. The news segment aired that night, showing footage of the fire truck, the hoses, and the city. Workers digging. The reporter used words like neighborly feud, revenge plot, and environmental crime. They showed a blurry picture of Mrs. Gable, identifying her as the alleged perpetrator. A new kind of anxiety began to settle over Alex. He wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was the subject of a news story. The phone rang constantly. It was local reporters, friends, family who had seen the news. He found himself giving the same vague, sanitized story over and over again, trying to distance himself from the vindictive nature of his original plan while also justifying his actions. The joy he had felt was gone, replaced by a deep-seated exhaustion. On Thursday, a letter arrived. It was from a law firm, not Mrs. Gable's, but one representing her. The letter was short and to the point. It was an official notice of intent to sue him for damages related to destruction of personal property, trespassing, and the illegal use of city resources for a personal vendetta, all of which had led to her false and malicious arrest. The letter felt absurd, but it was a formal declaration of war. She was in jail, but she was still fighting. "She's still not done," Alex said, tossing the letter on the counter. "Even from prison, she's still not done with us." "Alex, this is getting crazy," Sarah said, picking up the letter and reading it. "We need to get a lawyer, now." He nodded. He had no choice. The one-man war had turned into a full-scale, legal battle. Later that evening, the phone rang. It wasn't a number he recognized. He hesitated, then answered it. "Hello?" he said. There was a long silence on the other end. All he could hear was a faint, static-filled hum. He was about to hang up when a voice, distorted and low, spoke. It wasn't Mrs. Gable. It was a man. "You've created a lot of problems for a lot of people," the voice said, the words slurred and indistinct, as if spoken through a device. Alex's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "You don't need to know," the voice continued. "But you need to be smart. You need to keep your mouth shut about what you saw, what you uncovered. You keep your head down. You don't talk to the media. You don't talk to the police. And you definitely don't poke your nose where it doesn't belong." Alex felt his hand begin to shake. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. A dry, hollow laugh came from the other end. "Yeah, you do. You think that old bat did all that herself? You think she knew how to install a bypass line that clean? No. She paid good money. And now you've got the city asking questions. Questions we don't want answered. So I'm telling you, Mr. Alex, you drop the lawsuit. You clam up, or your little pool won't be the only thing we visit." The line went dead. Alex stood there, phone still to his ear, the dial tone a shrill siren in the quiet of his kitchen. This wasn't Mrs. Gable's paranoia. This was real. He hadn't just exposed an illegal sewer line. He had stumbled into something far bigger, a network, a criminal enterprise that had used her backyard as a part of their business. She wasn't the whole story. She was just the tip of a very dirty iceberg. He looked out the window at the dark, silent street. The digging had stopped for the night, the equipment a shadowy silhouette in the moonlight. But the threat was now closer, more menacing than anything Mrs. Gable could have ever mustered. He had thought he was fighting a single enemy, but in his moment of revenge, he had awakened a new, far more dangerous kind of enemy, and this one didn't care about a little bit of noise. The dial tone was a high-pitched scream in the silent kitchen. Alex stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear, his mind replaying the distorted, menacing voice. You drop the lawsuit. You clam up. Or your little pool won't be the only thing we visit. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. A dark, venomous promise that turned the simple act of being in his own home into an act of profound vulnerability. He slowly put the phone down, his hands trembling. The fear he felt was cold and sharp, a stark contrast to the boiling anger that had propelled him to action against Mrs. Gable. That had been an open, loud conflict. This was a silent, creeping terror. He wasn't just dealing with a cranky neighbor anymore. He was tangling with an unseen enemy who had a lot to lose. He walked into the living room where Sarah was still sitting on the sofa, clutching her hands in her lap. He didn't have to tell her. His face said it all. "What was that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with dread. It was a warning," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The person on the other end, they know what we found. The sewer line. They said Mrs. Gable didn't act alone. It was a whole operation. And they said if we don't drop the lawsuit and keep quiet, they'll visit us." Sarah's face crumpled. "Visit us? What does that even mean, Alex? The kids are home." She looked toward the stairs, a primal maternal fear filling her eyes. "We have to call the police. Right now." And, "Say what?" he said, his voice filled with frustration. "That some anonymous guy with a muffled voice threatened us? They'll say it was Mrs. Gable's lawyer trying to scare us. They won't be able to do anything. We have no proof." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Alex felt completely helpless. His bravado, his righteous anger, it all felt pointless in the face of this new, terrifying reality. He had been a hero in a suburban drama, but this was something else. This was a whole different kind of war, and he was completely outmatched. He spent the next 2 days in a state of hypervigilance. Every passing car made him jump. Every unknown phone number was an enemy. The joy of his home, the sanctuary he had fought so hard to reclaim, was gone. It had been replaced by a fortress of fear. The kids, sensing the tension, had stopped asking to use the pool. It sat there, a placid, shimmering body of water, but it was no longer a source of joy. It was a monument to the dangerous thing he had uncovered. He knew he couldn't live like this. He had to act. He thought about the phone call, the single detail that might be his only lead. The voice had said, Mrs. Gable paid good money for the installation of the bypass. That meant a contractor, someone local, someone who could perform an illegal job and get paid under the table. He started with the records. The fire department had provided him with a copy of their investigation report. He pored over it, looking for any clue, any detail. He found it. On the last page, buried in the technical findings. A note from one of the city workers. The bypass line's welding and pipe type are consistent with materials found in the inventory of a local plumbing and contracting firm. A name was listed, Cunningham Plumbing and Contracting. A chill ran down his spine. He knew Cunningham Plumbing. He'd seen their trucks all over the neighborhood. They were a family business, a local institution, the kind of people you trusted. He looked them up online. Their website was pristine, filled with glowing testimonials. It was the perfect facade for a dirty business. And the owner's photo, a balding man with a kind, grandfatherly smile. Alex had seen that face before. At the grocery store. At the gas station. He had seen him at the neighborhood 4th of July parade, waving at the kids. He was a pillar of the community. Alex knew what he had to do. He couldn't just call the police with a name and a hunch. He needed proof. He decided on a course of action that was as reckless as his original plan, but this time the stakes were life and death. He called Cunningham Plumbing. The phone rang once, then twice, before a man with a booming, friendly voice answered. Cunningham Plumbing, how can I help you? Hi, Alex said, his voice strained. My name is Alex and I live over on Elmwood Street. I'm having an issue with my main sewer line. I was hoping you could come take a look. Elmwood Street, the voice said, the boom gone, replaced by a slight pause. I believe we've had some recent work in your area. What exactly is the problem? I think there's a bypass line installed, Alex said, his heart pounding in his chest. I believe it's running from my neighbor's yard, and it might be causing some issues with my own plumbing. I was hoping you could come take a look at the handiwork. The silence on the other end was a physical thing. The friendly facade was gone. The mask had slipped. Mr. Alex, the voice said, low and dangerous, I think you've got the wrong guy. We don't do that kind of work. Really? Alex said, his voice gaining a new, chilling confidence. Because the city's report says the welding and materials are a perfect match for your inventory. And my pool has a weird smell all of a sudden. I'm sure it's a coincidence. But I'm also sure the police would love to hear from a contractor who has so much experience with these bypass lines. He heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. You listen to me, the voice hissed, no longer disguised. You keep your mouth shut. You don't know who you're messing with. Oh, I think I do, Alex said, his voice flat. I think I'm messing with a criminal organization that uses quiet suburbs to dump their waste. The quiet that was so important to Mrs. Gable? It was a cover. A very expensive, very illegal cover. And you made the biggest mistake of your life by threatening me and my family. He hung up the phone. He had what he needed. He had a confession, a direct link, and a reason to take this all the way. He walked to the living room where Sarah was watching him, a silent question in her eyes. It's him, Alex said, his voice grim. The plumber. He's the one who set it all up. He's the one who made the call. He grabbed her hand. It's over, Sarah. It's all over. He didn't call the police. Not yet. He had one last piece of business to attend to. He walked out to the backyard. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the pool. The surface of the water was perfectly still. The filter pump was humming its low, constant tune. It was the sound of his home, the sound of normalcy. He picked up a small rock and threw it into the water. The ripples spread out, distorting the golden reflection of the sky. The next morning, Alex and Sarah were on the front porch with their kids, watching as a fleet of unmarked cars and police vehicles, along with a SWAT van, descended upon the street. But this time, they didn't stop at Alex's house or Mrs. Gable's. They drove straight to the end of the block, where a Cunningham plumbing van was parked in a driveway. They watched as a team of officers stormed the house, their voices muffled by the distance. A few minutes later, the neighbors came out again, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. But this time, their eyes were on the house at the end of the street, not on Alex's. Alex had learned the hard way that the best way to deal with a big, loud problem was to make it someone else's. The street finally fell quiet. The reporters eventually left, the neighbors slowly returned to their routines, and the city finished their investigation. Mrs. Gable, it turned out, had indeed been a client of Cunningham's, paying a hefty sum to have her waste discreetly managed. The city's investigation found a network of similar illegal bypass lines throughout the county, all installed by Cunningham. Mrs. Gable's case was the one that blew the lid off the entire operation. Months later, the house next door was put up for sale. Alex and his family were in the backyard enjoying the summer heat. Noah was splashing in the shallow end, and Lily was floating on a raft, her laughter bubbling over the sound of the pump. The sounds were no longer a source of conflict. They were a celebration. Alex sat on his lounge chair, a quiet smile on his face. He watched his children play, the sun glinting off the water. He had gone to war for this simple, beautiful peace. And he had won. But he knew now, with a clarity that only came from the crucible of conflict, that peace wasn't the absence of noise. It was the absence of fear.